Welcome to this event that the International Union of Geological Sciences has organised, along with the Geological Society of London's Energy Group. And we decided that what we needed was a relatively informal discussion about the need for solutions. I think we all know that we need solutions for climate change, but the role of geoscientists in providing those solutions. So I stole this slide here actually from BBC Future Planet, which is going on at the moment, and they asked the question: as we face the world's greatest environmental challenges, what we need most is solutions. And in their case, Future Planet brings you stories of the ways that we can become a more sustainable place. So I think in general, it's clear that people are calling for solutions to the problems. We as scientists, I think in the past, we've tended to focus on providing the science evidence, but not necessarily taking that through to the solution. So the question really that we're going to be discussing today is are the geoscientists playing an active role or active part in these solutions? And probably the more difficult question is, can and should we advocate for solutions? So that just set the scene a bit. Now I'll pass it on to Mads Huus, who will give us an idea of how the day's going to roll forward. So Mads, over to you.
Thank you, John. My name is Mads Huus. I'm with the University of Manchester and the Energy Group of the Geological Society of London. And it's my privilege to try and guide all the presenters through today and also join the Q&A panel at the end. So the way we will do the questions for each talk is that we will pool them all together, and at 2:20 British time, we will be posing those questions to the speakers before we then give over to an open mic type session at the end. So all the attendees should have access to the Q&A and hopefully also to the chat. So feel free to drop questions anytime, and there will be a poll dropped, which we hope that everybody would like to fill out, because it will answer some of the questions that we pose along the way. And we will then be scene is Arishit Goswami, who's an IUGS steward. A little summary of how we get from COP26 to COP27 and perhaps beyond. Over to you, Arishit.
So yeah, the planet, the Earth, the place we are living in does not love us anymore. Seeing the way we have been polluting the atmosphere with greenhouse emissions, it won't be an understatement to say that humans are the most suicidal species in the world. Take, for instance, the projections that have been created by Ziku's father this year, the projections that bear a testimony to how unpleasant our future looks like, since it will require a massive reduction in the CO2 emissions to save us from a temperature rise of more than 2 degrees Celsius. That's obviously not a great news. And so is not the data from the climate tipping points that shows that boreal permafrost, Greenland ice sheet, Brent sea ice, low latitude coral reefs in Australia, and West Antarctic ice sheet, all of them have a tipping point below 2 degrees Celsius. So a lot of damage will anyways still be done to the planet despite the best efforts we can do to undo the harm that we have done so far. If that is not alarming you enough, then here is another assessment that shows how the climate tipping point is gradually shifting to lower temperatures year after year, which indicates the criticality of the situation at hand. Continuing on how well we are doing on our emission reducing targets, well, information from DNV suggests that cutting global CO2 emissions by half by 2030 relative to 2017 is almost unattainable. And the net zero report finds that emission reduction likely by 2030 is going to be only 30%. Yes, you heard it right, only 30%. For the world to reach net zero emissions by 2050, the leading economies have to act faster. North America and Europe need to reach zero emissions in 2042 itself, while Greater China should reduce emissions by 98% by 2050. Developing countries will be far from decarbonization. For example, sub-Saharan Africa will reduce emissions just by 23%, and the Indian subcontinent with only 64%. Now, as we head to the Conference of Parties 27, our leaders will be walking in with a lot of responsibility on their shoulders. And the world will be watching with curiosity in anticipation of the next steps for all of us. Why so? Well, the answer is that despite the dark clouds of climate change that overshadow this conference, there is still a silver lining of hope. A hope that we can still exercise caution and wisdom to mend our ways, to do the needful in the face of climate crisis. The war in Ukraine has been an unpleasant situation without doubt. However, it has sped up the change that we need in the energy sector. The high prices of fossil fuels have are going to reduce the fossil fuel demand and will massively increase the competitiveness of the renewable technologies. The removal of 5% of global fossil fuel supply from Russia will inevitably mean that some new coal and LNG supply will have to be found out. However, the net fossil fuel demand will still fall. Data modeling by Asad Razok also shows that the fossil fuel demand may soon collapse, which includes similar trends for global oil demand, coal demand, and gas demand. And all the questions remain over the supply squeeze of metals needed in the global mass electrification, yet the demand is going to reduce. Another good thing, a number of new jobs will also get created. The IEA has calculated that there are already more jobs in clean energy sector than in the fossil fuel sector. And an energy transition would mean net gain of 22 million jobs. There has also been a dramatic policy shift in the past 5 years. As one country sets a target, it gets easier for the other countries to follow suit because they derive inspiration from the previous country. Trends show that the number of countries with pledges have been increasing over the years, with an increasing ban on the combustion cars and an increasing amount of carbon taxes. Not to forget, finally, that there are few case studies from around the world. While India is exploring possibilities of bilateral scientific cooperation in the emerging areas of weather and climate research, the European Union has legislation across multiple policy areas for at least 55% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. The French president has also pledged to increase the France climate finance to 6 billion euros per year. Such measures, without doubt, do create a ripple effect as it encourages other countries to also follow suit. Now, as we steadily head towards Conference of Parties 27, we need to be mindful that a lot needs to be done by our governments, by our academia, by public and private institutions, and by all of us, the civil society. Yes, there is not much time, but there is still hope. There is still hope. Back to you.
Thank you, Arashid. That was a great scene setting and also a nice message at the end. Next up is Giuseppe Di Capua from the International Association for Promotion of Geoethics, and he will talk specifically about the geoethics of advocacy. Over to you, Giuseppe.
Thank you. I share my screen. Okay, good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event. It is clear for science that the climate crisis, or more precisely the ecological crisis, is not a natural event. The climate crisis is an effect of a specific attitude of the human being towards other humans and nature. And more generally, it is the consequence of human willingness of power and domination by individuals and groups over what is other than oneself. We know to be creative, intelligent, cooperative beings, but we are also selfish, ruthless, and destructive beings. We live in this ambivalence of species, walking in balance on the thin blade of the abyss while creating and shaping our ecological niche. But through culture, education, the exercise of sociability, ethics, we can shift this risky balance ranking between a vital creativity and a destructive madness towards our wiser side. This graph shows the contempt for the human being with disastrous effects on the environment, which in turn will contribute to produce further negative effects on the other human beings who live thousands of kilometers from the emission points. What else is the climate crisis if not a crisis of the human being and this network of relationships? We do not hesitate to destroy our infrastructures to affirm the geopolitical logic of conflicting relations, continuing to increase emissions of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. The war of humans in Ukraine is killing future generations of humans and having a gigantic environmental impact that we will only understand when the war is over. This graph shows that unexpected events produced by the destructive side of our human nature are always possible and can affect the effectiveness of our actions to mitigate climate crisis in every moment. This represents a major limitation to our strategy to find solutions to the ecological crisis. This other graph is a hope, a vision of the future of a carbon net zero society. Our technology allows to hope for this future. But is a future like the one envisaged by this graph possible without solidarity, community involvement, sharing of a system of common ethical principles and values on which to base a new global social pact? I say that this graph is closer to a dream rather than to a realistic strategy with precise time steps. Unfortunately, it cannot take into account the complexity of reality, the intricate web of relationships, and the actions and feedbacks that characterize the Earth system. Precisely because it is not realistic, this graph urges us to accelerate our actions towards a carbon net zero world, because further sudden stops and partial regressions of our initiatives and projects are always possible in every moment. History is not a linear process. There are also moments of involution, decline that take us away from our goals and sometimes make them impossible. We need to open our minds to the non-linearity of processes. We need to consider the disequilibrium as the ontological status of the reality, as a set of transient equilibria. Probably this consideration can produce frustration and fear in all of us. On the other side, I would say they urge us to acting by taking our future in our hands for what we can. In the short and medium term, we can become aware and responsible social actors. Over the longer term, this planetary crisis can help us to develop a common identity of species, making us go beyond national states for merging into a conscious planetary community of destiny, as already we are unconsciously. Now we must act on the level of individual and collective behaviors. We have to act as a community of citizens and professionals, and as governments, valuing success stories existing in human history and avoiding those hasty moral judgments on history that feed future conflicts and distorted visions of our past. For example, the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, adopted in 1987, is a landmark multilateral environmental agreement that regulates the production and consumption of nearly 100 man-made chemicals referred to as ozone-depleting substances. This is the case of a successful living cooperative action to invert the ozone depletion. but also the Paris Agreement, that is legally binding international treaty on climate change, entered into force in November 2016, is another great achievement by the international community, despite many shadows in its application. But I also mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations, proclaimed in 1948. These are all examples of our cooperative attitude in front of common planetary issues that should be taught in schools and universities. But what can the geoscience community do to promote international cooperation and human progress? It already does a lot. It provides knowledge and data, develops scenarios, suggests technical solutions to decision makers. And it can do much more, but to do this, it must strengthen its dimension of international community. It must give greater importance to its bodies that have a transnational sphere of action, such as the IUGS. It must become aware and enhance its cultural role for society. Geosciences are not just a technical and knowledge tools. Geosciences conveys a vision of the world that is fundamental for modifying our interpretative categories of reality and our human relationships. Geosciences produce a technical scientific knowledge crucial for the great challenges of the coming decades, from energy, mineral and freshwater supply to the defense against geohazards till the mitigation of climate change effects. But we are aware also that geosciences, as other scientific disciplines, should improve their public image and societal credibility, as well as the culture of geosciences should become a pillar on which to reform our school and university educational systems to prepare a planetary citizenship for the future. This is what geoethics strongly affirms from years. Geoethics means building a way of thinking and acting based on geoscience knowledge and its cultural implications, guided by the principles of dignity, freedom, and responsibility. So geoethics is not simply a theoretical framework for the human agency. It provides also input for geoscience community to widen its cultural, pedagogical, and societal perspectives. The geoscience community must take a big step forward in placing at the center of its action not only the development of geoknowledge and its practical applications. It has to put at the center of its interest the geoscience education as the key to redefine the human being-nature interaction, as well as the communication of geosciences, or rather, the communication of the thought and vision of geosciences, of its epistemological foundations, and the significance of looking at the world from a geosystemic point of view to strengthen the value of geoscience for society. To conclude, the carbon net zero strategy should consider unpredictable events in the next decades. These unpredictable events will create additional problems in reaching our goals for mitigate climate change and creating a more sustainable society. All this pushes us to warn society and decision makers that we must accelerate in changing, sometimes even in a radical way, productive and consumption paradigms that have fed the ecological crisis. Geosciences provide a range of interventions to help in this direction. We know what to do. We don't have yet understood that we don't have an infinitive time to do it. More in depth, geosciences can do much more for society than assuming only a scientific advisory role. The range of problems to be faced are rooted in the way in which human beings relate to themselves and nature. Firstly, these are cultural problems. And geosciences can greatly contribute to human progress also on a cultural level, as done in the past. From my geological perspective, geoscience community has to work at an international level to promote the inclusion of the geological knowledge in the student curricula at all levels. Geological knowledge provides a peculiar point of view that can change the human being-nature interaction from an anthropocentric perspective to a more complex vision informed by responsible anthropocentric, biocentric, ecocentric, geocentric perspectives. In addition, The geoscience community has to work to improve its societal credibility and public trust through a new way to communicate geosciences that can become a pedagogical action for the larger audience. This is the geoethical awareness of the societal and cultural role of geosciences. Ultimately, geoethics is the core of geosciences for developing new cultural perspectives for society. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. That was very much to the point. The next speaker is Professor Ian Stewart, who, in addition to being known from television, at least in the UK, he's also the research chair of the, sorry, I lost my notes here, the El Hassan Research Chair for Sustainability, and he's also the UNESCO Chair for Geoscience and Society. So no one better to talk about the Geocoms rethink.
Thanks very much, Mads. Let me just share my screen, and you should see it full screen now. If you can confirm that, fantastic. So thank you to Giuseppe for raising a number of fundamental issues that I'm going to actually pick up on and carry on in relation to communication, which was mentioned there by Giuseppe. So the lockdown, I'm sure for everyone, changed the perspectives that we have in our everyday lives or our professional lives. And certainly for me, it was a chance to really think about something that Giuseppe's been underpins his talk about, the purpose of geoscience, the societal purpose of geoscience. What is it that we do? What is why does geoscience exist, for what general mission? And this is something that from the constraints of my own bedroom and in relation and collaboration with some people from BHP and from a UNESCO project, we started reaching out to a whole bunch of other people that were thinking of these issues. And you'll see a link to this project where we've made our films and podcasts and things like that about people talking about what is the purpose of geoscience as we look to the future. I'll put a link to the film in the chat at the end, but what you'll see is a series of quotes through this presentation. That is quotes from people's views on this challenge. So anyone who knows me knows that really what I'm interested in is telling Earth stories, talking about earth science, geology, geoscience, whatever we call it, to a non-technical audience, to a kind of public audience. And that's really about finding stories to tell about the planet. And actually it's pretty easy. But one of the things that's interesting, and certainly comes out of that short film that we made, is the need that the stories that we have at the moment are not good enough. We need new narratives for the geosciences. And that's something that comes out of Giuseppe's talk as well. And in terms of, I work mainly with the BBC, and that's a big thing around storytelling, is that it's not just that, how do we develop these new narratives? Well, if you talk to people who make Hollywood movies and stories and books and things like that, you'll know that there are various types of narrative plot structures that take you through. That it's not simply, we don't simply just tell people about geoscience or indeed about net zero or the energy transition, and people say, fine, we need compelling, interesting narratives to take people on that journey through geoscience in order to really let them understand the critical importance that geoscience has in addressing these issues. So there's various narratives, but I'm going to take one, and I'm going to take us through this talk with that narrative. And the narrative I'm going to take is the rags to riches story. So many books and Hollywood movies are based on the rags to riches story. Probably the classic one is Aladdin, the penniless urchin boy who gets into all sorts of terrible trouble. It really he descends into despair, etc. And then gradually finds this lamp, rubs the lamp, a genie comes out, and he goes on a journey of exploration and challenge before finally emerging successful, becomes the prince, gets Jasmine, and you know the rest. But this is a very common narrative. And so I think this has got some something to tell us about today, because the point is that in the narrative, the rags to riches, the protagonist, the character that starts off below, relatively negatively. They're in a pretty rough spot. And I think we all recognize that geologists are, even in the successful times, we're seen as a slightly strange crowd of people right on the edge of the sciences. It was the Kardashians of science. It was this rather unfamiliar alien science, that almost cult-like science that we were involved in. But the trouble is that from that low point, even while we were getting employed in oil and gas and employed in mining and doing well, the point is that from there, we've actually descended further. We've descended into the descent. Act 1 of our rags to riches story is the descent into hell, as the business as usual practice of geoscience that's employed hundreds of thousands of geoscientists is now toxic. It's seen as digging holes in the ground. It's seen as the environmental legacy of oil and gas production is the effects that we have. It's a whole bunch of stuff around biodiversity loss, etc. So this quote here from Niall McCormack, ex-head of head chief geologist at BHP, talks about, what we look like to the public is something from 50 years ago, that we're out there to rape and pillage the planet. If you talk to a lot of people, and if you talk particularly to students that are coming in, there's a sense of that geology is a 20th century science, that it's now not really appropriate fit for purpose for the different challenges of the 21st century. So how do we get out of that? How do we come out of the descent into hell and climb the mountain of purgatory, which is the Act 2 in our rags to riches story? The challenges that we have. Well, what we're talking about today, the context of today, is one set of challenges, one set of opportunities, a ladder to climb out, and that is the idea of net zero and the energy transition. The idea that geoscience is critical to this really important part. And there's certainly some key narratives that we need to overcome on that journey. This is the words of Scott Tinker from the film. And he makes the point about that we're all talking about renewables, but actually the sun and the wind are renewable, heat and light and motion, but the stuff to extract that energy isn't. The stuff that you see in the image here. The wind turbines, the solar panels, batteries aren't renewable. There's nothing renewable about them. We mine them, we manufacture them, we dispose of them in landfills or recycle, and we do it again. That is so critical for people to begin to understand. So there's a narrative there about trying to understand what we mean by renewable and the embodied carbon that's in that kind of energy system. That then leads to a natural thing that is again mentioned in the film, that a world that has less carbon in it has a whole lot more mining in it. So this is the salt flats in Bolivia. And if we want to take that petrol consumption engine car and change it into an electric vehicle, then we're probably going to have to dig up some of the large 30% of the world's lithium reserves that sit in this beautiful place. Are people ready for that kind of issue? This goes back to Giuseppe. These are ethical questions. They're not necessarily technical questions, but they're also narratives that aren't really being discussed out there in the public. And that then leads to this point here, really, which is talking about, again, I think this was from Niall, talking about the single largest challenge that's out there that we know of for society for the next 30 years is how to grow a prosperous world while taking care of the same world at the same time. And so that it seems to me to be a fundamental challenge that, yes, we can grow, we can talk about the economic arguments for geoscience and grow in a prosperous world, but we've got this other thing that we've not had to deal with before, which is actually taking care of the world at the same time in terms of the environmental aspects. So all of those parts really, if we can pass them and start to explain the narrative of how geoscience deliver it, slowly climbs us out then of that purgatory world. And it leads us into other places. So, for example, Laura Tyler, head of chief geologist at BHP, talks about saying, guess what? As geologists, we know where the water is. That by the middle of the century, maybe water is going to be the absolutely critical thing. And geoscientists, particularly with hydrogeologists and subsurface water, we know where the water is. These are other narratives that we need to bring to the attention. But my point really is here that this narrative around the energy transition and net zero, I don't think takes us the full way from rags to riches. I think it starts to allow us to climb out. But really, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the net zero and the energy transition is one part of a wide variety of social aspects that the planet is concerned with. And I think there's a whole set of other areas that geoscience needs to address to really demonstrate the critical importance of geoscience to the society. So if we really want to climb to get real riches, I think this quote here that, as a science, as geoscience, has to be increasingly people-centric. It's about doing something that's transformational for the world, not just economically, but in a wider sense too. What I mean by that? Well, the narrative needs to be less about just the economy and jobs, etc., and more about what's becoming known as the well-being economy. In other words, that it's about human well-being, of which one part is economic well-being. And we published a paper earlier this year looking at how that might look like in terms of narratives for the energy transition, and this is called the Three Horizons. And what we see in the vertical axis is how prevalent certain views are. So you'll see the grey horizon, the grey curve, is the dominant one. This is business as usual. This is the way that we work at the moment. We're really looking at the mining industry here. And it's about, complying to standards and minimizing impact. But actually, we know if we just keep going that, then mining will be a dinosaur. It's not compatible with what we need in terms of genuinely driving well-being. So there's an intermediate horizon, the blue one, which is basically an entrepreneurial space where we can try things. We can try things about responsible sourcing. We can start to be cleverer about environmental protection, be clever about the stakeholders, and try to develop a circular economy. But actually, that's not probably going to get us all the way there. We need to be more fundamental. And actually, the fundamental radical one, visionary approach at the bottom, is the green one, talks about purpose-driven mining, nature-positive solutions, mining as a social development progress, not an economic development progress. And these are about new narratives that we have to sell what we do. And so this point here really, again, that talks about the big picture, that planetary stewardship, that planetary citizenship that Giuseppe was talking about. The big challenges that we face, those are humanity's problems. And if there's any science that really can have an impact globally, then it's geology. It gives you that context of humanity's place in the universe. And you kind of understand that the Earth is unique in many ways for our species, and we better take care of it. And what I mean by that is that some of the most sitting below the SDGs, kind of oblivious in them, is two important concepts. One of them is planetary boundaries, the notion that Johan Rockström and colleagues came out with more than 10 years ago, that there are certain thresholds that if we pass, then we're in a really bad place. So we need to understand that is a planetary stewardship problem, and geoscientists are fundamental to that. But added on to the planetary boundary one is the idea of the donut economics, which is if there's an ecological ceiling to the planet's behavior, well, there's a social basement, a social foundation to all of the social issues, and that the bit in between, that narrow life buoy in between, is a safe and just space for humanity. So we can't just deal with the environmental geoscience thing. We need to be dealing with the social aspects as well, and keeping humanity in that safe space. And so for me, just to finish on this slide, really, I think that of course we need to think about the SDGs, but the SDGs take us another few years, and delivering on some of those SDGs might not necessarily deliver on staying within planetary boundaries. And that is a geoscience issue, and geoscientists need to be involved in that issue. So it's not just about net zero and energy transition. That's a short-term space that addresses one part. We need to see geoscience as for a science for the long-term sustainable human well-being. And on that point, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian, for that radical yet informed roadmap for the future of sciences. Our next speaker is Alison Meston from the International Science Council. who will talk about the role of science and science unions.
Thank you very much, Mads, and thank you to everybody so far. And I just wanted to check with Ian Stewart in his slide that he called Descent to Hell, if indeed that picture was Kalgoorlie, and if it was, that is where I grew up in Western Australia. So I think
it's Super Pit in
it is
Kalgoorlie.
Super Pit,
So,
and somewhere in that slide will be the little house where I spent as a small child. So I have somehow climbed out of hell, and I am now at the International Science Council. I'm going to just share with you a few ideas today about international science structures, and you might be wondering how this fits into today's talk. I'm currently at the Royal Society in the UK, and there is a lovely list here provided in the 1700s by Robert Boyle, where they list all of the things that they want to achieve in their scientific lives, including things like the art of flying, the prolongation of life, and two interesting ones. They want to sleep better and have pleasant dreams, but at the same time, they want to explore a tea that helps them stay awake. So I wanted to share this with you because I think this really looks into the future of curiosity, which is what builds the scientific method. So let's have a look at essentials. The International Science Council is a global membership-based organisation, and we bring together natural and social science. And our vision is for science as a global public good. And in fact, Jeffrey Bolton, who is a geologist that some of you might know, has written a paper on science as a global public good, and I'll put this into the chat in a little minute. And our mission is to be the global voice of science. And you might be wondering, I'm a geologist on the coalface, or I'm a different kind of scientist. What does this mean for me? And what it means is that your scientific unions, your geoscience unions, are members of the International Science Council, and together we build a global voice for science. One of our patrons is Mary Robinson, and the reason I share this with you today is she has been a really important voice at the COPs. She has brought new voices to the Conference of Parties for the UNFCCC. And what she talks about today is some of the things that speakers have already talked about, and that is empowering citizens to be active engagers in finding solutions to our climate emergency. And again, I agree with her, there's never been a more important time for science. There's never been an important time for all science, including geosciences, and of course, including done in what we would describe as a transdisciplinary way. So the International Science Council, we have a number of affiliated and international scientific bodies, some of which do work in the climate area. Some of those include the World Climate Programme, the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk. Now, actually, it's the World Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, the 13th of October, where we get together and we look at the risks that are coming in terms of the extreme weather events and issues like this. So this is how your voice, if you are a member of your scientific union, this is how your voice plays out at the international level. And again, it plays out at the UN interface. So for example, the International Science Council has a very close working relationship with the World Meteorological Organization, with the UNDRR, with UNEP and other organizations. So I really want to impart today that I want to empower you to strengthen your geological and geoscience unions so that your voice is heard at a global level. I mean, you might be surprised to learn that there is currently no mechanism for science at the UN General Assembly. So there was when Ban Ki-moon was UN Secretary General. There isn't at the moment, and this is something that the International Science Council is working very closely with to make sure that the voice of science is heard at the UN level, because after all, it is at the UN level where all of the countries signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. And again, these are some of the processes that we worked in. So I've talked about the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I've mentioned that today is actually International Disaster Risk Reduction Day, and part of that is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And of course, we work on the Paris Agreement on Climate Change for the UNFCCC. We also work for international years. So some of you might recall a couple of years ago, it was the International Year of the Periodic Table of the Elements. We're working for the International Decade for Ocean Development. We're currently working for the International Year of Basic Sciences for Development. I note again some of the earlier speakers who've talked about the need for communication and how we tell science stories. We are currently working on an International Year of Science Engagement in the year 2027. So again, this all leads to how do we raise science voices? How do we raise our stories at the UN level and at that policy framework level so that we can have honest knowledge brokerage to get the policies we need to live in a sustainable planet? The ISC obviously has our action plan, and again, the geological unions as members of the International Science Council help to formulate this action plan. And one of our key areas that we're working in is global sustainability. And what we're saying to everybody is that the planet is on red alert. We are far off track on the SDGs. We need to redouble our efforts to reset humanity's relationship with the planet. That will ensure that we have a self-sustaining environment. The two key areas which I think are important to the geological science unions are we are working on a global commission for science missions for sustainability. So it is led by Irina Bokova, the former Director General of UNESCO, and Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and before that with UNEP. And we have mobilised a group of philanthropists, famous people, thought leaders. We have James Cameron, the film director, as part of this group, because we have realised that if we do not mobilise serious funding and have science missions in the same way as we had missions, the missions to the moon, for example, if we don't do this, we are not going to attain the SDGs. So this is one way where we are thinking, what missions are required for us to reach the SDGs? And I've just, heard again a number of speakers talk about that geological sciences has to be at the heart of fixing the planet for a sustainable human existence. So I want people to look out for, in the not too distant future, we will be launching this, and we will be going to the scientific unions and saying what mission science do we need in order to reach the SDGs. The second area, which I've touched on briefly, is the Hazards Definition and Classification Project. And again, this is a project that we're working with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And again, I think that's a place where ordinary geologists, ordinary geoscientists can participate. The UN met a couple of weeks ago, and they would have heard from Antonio Guterres, the UN's Secretary General. He convened an SDG moment because they are frankly very concerned that due to the COVID, due to the issue of the global financial system requiring reform, and let's remember that the global financial system is primarily based on extracting fossil fuels, we are again in serious trouble of reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. And they talk about a crisis in food security, health, education, and environment, and peace and security. And as far as we're concerned, the Ukraine war is possibly going to set back sustainability 10 years or more. And I also want to mention briefly the education crisis. And again, you might be thinking, what does geoscience have to do with this? And what I would say to you is we keep talking about net 2050, net zero at 2050. In 2050, your early career scientists will be 40 years old. They're currently 10. These 10-year-olds have missed out on up to 8 months of their education because of the COVID pandemic. And what does that mean for future scientists? What does that mean for the future thought leaders? So the International Science Council is going to be launching a new project on education with our members, headed by our Vice President, Motoko Katani. And again, it's to make sure that we are on top of examining these critical issues on how we reconceptualize science education for all levels, for lifelong learning opportunities. So again, I go back to this list that I talked to you about, and my challenge for you today is, what's your list? This is the list from Boyle from the 1700s at the Royal Society. What is the list for the geoscientists? What is your list that's going to spark creativity, that's going to get you thinking about your future? What is the collective force of the international geoscientists going to look like? What is your science for missions for sustainability? And how are you going to contribute to the SDG framework? It's not a perfect framework, but it's the only framework we have, and it's the framework that all nations have signed up to. Here's a health check. How are your scientific unions faring in 2022? Are they fit for purpose for the 21st century? Are you bringing in and organising young and early career scientists to be part of the international science ecosystem? Essentially, how are you ensuring the voice of science is being heard, and how are you going to continue that voice up until 2050 and beyond to make sure that those voices are heard if we're going to get to net zero? And finally, you know, how are we going to unpick the challenges? And I felt, as the daughter of a geologist, I needed to have a presentation with a geological hammer in it. What are the challenges? You know, our challenges seem wicked. Sometimes they seem insurmountable. And again, I think back to Ian's picture of the open cut mine in Kalgoorlie. Where are we on those levels in the world's biggest open cut mine? How do we crawl out of this hole that we have dug ourselves? We are in urgent need to organise mission-based science to provide hope that humanity can live sustainably. And I believe that we can have hope. I think sometimes we hear presentations today that are very depressing. I think science has to be the voice of hope. We have to give young people hope, and we have to absolutely ensure that science can dig ourselves out of this particular hole that humanity is currently in. And I absolutely have hope, if we ask these difficult questions, about making sure that we can provide mission-based science to support the SDGs. And with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alison. That was quite a lot of very good questions that we can perhaps pick up later in the roundtable. But lots and lots of food for thought for geoscientists in there, that's for sure. And very good to see the overall missions that you're embarking on. Okay, the next on our list is the president of the International Union of Geological Sciences, John Ludden, who will talk about the possible role of geosolutions. Yeah, over to you, John.
Yeah, thanks to everyone who's spoken up to now. And put my picture on, sorry. There you go. Thanks to everyone who's spoken up to now, and thanks very much to Alice and Justin for setting the challenges to us as geoscientists and our unions. I'm not going to answer them, but I do think there is a role for us to try and take those challenges. But, you know, I'm president of a union that has about 120 member countries, more than 1 million people in principle following. I was president of the, the European Geoscience Union in the past, and it's really, really difficult to get people to move out of their silos and actually move behind mission-based science that you're proposing. But we have to do it. And this slide here just sort of, sorry, my slides are changing automatically. This one's going to change automatically too. It's my fault, I think. Okay. Okay, that's good. All right, sorry, I've got an automatic timer on this thing. I didn't take off yet. Anyway, we're members of a number of unions that we're kind of a disparate group of people, and we need to try and find some way of getting behind a collective movement. And I guess the question is sort of, why does geoscience matter? And clearly, you know, this slide comes from global earthquake model actually, but it shows basically what the main things that are facing geoscience: understanding the dynamics of the earth, creating a safe and healthy planet, driving sustainable growth, and reducing global inequities. And I've recently added this fifth point here, which is that geoscience needs to address challenges facing the earth. And that's kind of where we are. So what are the current drivers of geoscience? And they are diversification of energy supplies and decarbonization, reducing global emissions, understanding risk as well as the hazard, population change, big data and information sciences, and in particular in a world where there's much tougher environmental regulations, as there should be, and much greater public scrutiny. So the question that I would like us to sort of try and address, and thanks very much to everyone who's spoken today, we are trying to address this, is can we advocate solutions to climate change, but with appropriate caveats, the risks, the governance, and all that's required in those solutions? And how do we partner with a more united voice? And I think, you know, the terminology that Alison was coming out there about planetary health check and a mission behind it. How as geoscientists can we come towards that mission? And in particular as geologists, and as I think as Ian said and other people have said, we are viewed as being on the dirtier side of geosciences because we are somewhat responsible for putting the carbon out there in the first place. So how do we change? How do we move out into this new world of providing a solution and advocating for these solutions, but with the appropriate caveats? So that's all I had to say, and I'll leave it there. Thank you. Sorry about the slides.
Thank you, John. The next speaker is Chloe Hill from the European Geosciences Union, and she will be talking about microscale advocacy and more.
Sorry, always takes a second. Thanks, Matt. Right, so hi everyone, my name is Chloe Hill and I am the Policy Manager for the European Geosciences Union. As Mads mentioned, this is the topic I was asked to speak about, but I'm actually going to start with something that's a little bit different. The first thing I want to, if I can click, great, talk about is a bit of a practical issue. So I was asked to talk about advocacy and how science can engage with it. And we have already heard a bit about advocacy from the speakers already today. But the first thing I want to highlight is the difference between advocacy and science advice, and why scientists need to understand the role they're playing when they are engaging with policymaking. So when we engage in advocacy, we are generally supporting a particular policy outcome. We are lobbying for policymakers to take a decision in one direction or another. Now, while scientists can do this, and in some instances it is needed, I think the scientific community's more important role is providing scientific advice. So this is giving policymakers timely, relevant, and useful information so that they can make an evidence-informed decision that considers all of the potential consequences of any action or inaction. So providing science advice still requires policy engagement. It requires scientists to understand the political landscape and where more evidence is needed, and it does require them to frame their research, as Ian was talking about. But instead of recommending one policy over another, it provides a range of policy options, and it allows policymakers to be the ones to make the decisions. And then scientists can stand back, they can rely on their expertise, they can rely on the scientific information, while knowing they provided policymakers with a service that other advocacy and other lobby groups are unable to provide. So again, this isn't to say that there isn't room for advocacy, there definitely is. But this is just a very important distinction that I want to make before we do jump into the rest of the presentation today. Now, the rest of the presentation, I will actually be focusing more on policy engagement more generally. So it refers to both advocacy and science advice. But yeah, I think maybe something we get into a bit more of a discussion on later on as well. So as an individual scientist, how can you more effectively engage in policy? This could be a very long presentation. I've kept it relatively short today. So the first thing I would recommend is to be strategic about your approach. Now, we've heard a bit about the geosciences today, but they are actually extremely broad. They relate to a lot of different policy areas, including climate, but including basically every other policy if you sort of have your scope broad enough. So the first thing I would say is, as scientists, we're incredibly busy people. We can't engage in every policy issue. It's important to pick the one that you want to engage in and really focus on that. It takes a lot of time to really get into a policy, to understand the policy landscape, to know the right people. So it is important that we are targeted, and that includes actually selecting the level of governance that you want to engage with as well, whether that be on a local level or a national level or an EU level. Really being more targeted will allow you to be more effective in your policy engagement. The next step is to, of course, understand the policy landscape once you have selected your targeted approach, to understand how the decisions are made on that governance level you selected, what sort of external opinions are considered and when in the policy cycle they're considered, and who the key actors are. And then it's a matter of becoming bilingual in both science and policy. Obviously, as scientists, we actually speak our own language. We use a lot of jargon, and the way in which we talk to each other is different to how we should talk to the public, and how we talk to policymakers, and how policymakers talk to themselves. If we do want to be able to effectively engage, we have to be able to get on the same level, to be able to speak the same language as policymakers, and learning how to do that is really important. Which takes us into the next step, which is learning skills that will help you engage. Now, as someone who works on the science policy interface, I can only give a recommendation here, and that is to look at the European Commission Joint Research Centre's competence framework. This is a relatively new framework that has been put out by this Joint Research Centre. I will put it in the chat box as a link. It is a fantastic resource that outlines these 27 different skills the scientists can develop to help them engage. It's incredibly useful, includes things like drafting briefings, brokering knowledge, how to synthesize information and communicate uncertainty, all of these different types of skills. And one thing that they really, really emphasize with this competency framework is that one scientist cannot do it alone. So these skill sets are really for teams of scientists to learn together. Which leads me to the last and probably most important point, and that is that as individual scientists, we can't do this by ourselves. So I was asked to speak on this micro level today about how scientists can engage in policy, but the most important tip I can give you is to engage with your scientific community and with external stakeholders as well. So we do need these strong and diverse scientific communities, because engaging in policy is incredibly time consuming, as I mentioned. Having a group of people who are working on a similar issue, a similar policy issue, can help you minimize the amount of time that's needed to track this policy news and to connect with policymakers. It creates a wider pool of knowledge than you would have otherwise. Quite often with policy issues, they do require a really diverse range of scientific inputs from more than just one discipline. And so, connecting with these other disciplines, these other scientists, can be really useful for that reason. It can allow you to find areas of consensus, areas that a lot of different scientists think are really important to focus on, and then to highlight that to the policymakers that are working on these policy issues. And it reduces this duplication as well. So all of these points actually lead you into being able to create a really effective information synthesis, to be able to broker that knowledge and work with others. So I think that also leads into what John was saying in terms of creating these communities. And I think this particular event as well is a really great start to that, creating these communities of scientists who want to engage in the policy interface, who want to be able to impact policy in a positive way, and to meet them, network with them, connect with them afterwards, and yeah, share information that is relevant. So that is actually quick presentation today. That is where I'm going to leave it. As I said, I will put the link to this JRC competence framework into the chat, and we can probably have more of a talk about this after we finish today. So.
Thank you very much, Chloe. It's good to get the proper European perspective as well. Now, have we got the polls? I think we have polls results now. Are you able to share them? Just waiting for the polls. This was a sort of general introduction to how geoscientists get out there and with the message to the general public, to policy level and so on. And now we have some more technical talks lined up, both on what do we do with all this carbon, what is net zero, how do we get rid of carbon, and also how do we fully exploit geothermal. So we cannot show this. Okay, so I've got a poll here on my right, and the first question is, will we manage to keep global warming under 2 degrees? And there was a multiple choice of 2. 37% said yes, and 63% said no. So that is pessimistic or optimistic, who knows. When do you think the world will reach net zero? The options were 2050, 2060, or 2070, or later, and 53% opted for 2070 or later, with 29% for 2060 and 18% for 2050. The third question: how important is the role of geoscience in reaching net zero? 75%, and I guess we may be speaking to the converted by the look of this, thought it is crucial. 31% thought geoscience would be important, and nobody thought it would be minor, which is good news for geoscientists. Also put a lot of responsibility on us. The fourth question is, whose job is it to represent the geosciences at policy level? This was a multiple choice. So the most popular is geosocieties, 51% voted for that. The percentages don't add up here, and they're closely followed by the geo-unions, geo-industry, everyone. So is across the board, basically, it's all of us as much as we can by the look of this. The fifth question, do you think geoscience is already well represented at policy level, such as the UN and at the COPs? Half of people don't think so, but also 43% answered don't know. This was again a multiple choice thing. Only 6% thought that we were well represented. Sixth question, question number 6. Does geoscience have a communication problem? 63% said possibly, and a quarter of us said yes. Only 4% thought no. Finally, question 7 is, do you think geoscientists should be advocates for climate solutions? And 78% thought that yes, this is a climate emergency, we need all to do what we can. 22% said possibly, and 2% said no. Okay, that was the poll, and we will try and graphicalize the poll so that it can be shared. Okay, so our next speaker is Professor Stuart Haseldine of the University of Edinburgh, and he will talk to us about restoring carbon with nature and geology. Thank you for joining us, Stuart.
I'll try sharing the screen first of all. So it's good. Can you hear me okay, Mads?
It's a good sound, and now we have the screen as well.
Terrific, nicely working. Okay, so I'm told that we're seriously severe timekeepers, so I'm just going to crack on and run through these types of slides to try and explain what carbon capture and storage is about, how it's widespread application across industry, oil and gas, of course, where most people most think about it, but also we can store carbon using nature-based solutions. And I think it's important to acknowledge and include all of these options, partly because we're in a climate crisis and partly because it's a way in which everybody, all citizens can contribute. It's not just about big industry, it's about rural, it's about agriculture, it's about cities. All of those have a material role to play. And so where have we come from? Where are we going? So this graph shows here the recent history of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration from 1990, which of course is the reference year for the United Nations, through to 2021. And then vertically, not starting from zero, are billions of tons of carbon dioxide annual emissions into the atmosphere, thousands of millions of tons. And you can see that my point here is quite simple, that there is a relentless and continuous increase of carbon dioxide emission in spite of all the United Nations meetings, in spite of all the other meetings, and in spite of all the treaties, conferences, and good words. We're still heading rapidly and accelerating rapidly in the wrong direction, because carbon dioxide is one of the main drivers for global warming, which is one of the main drivers for climate change, ocean acidification, and all those other bad things we can talk about. And one of the intriguing things here, as well as heading in the wrong direction, is in the pandemic years, there was a small blip, a small decrease, but that's more than compensated for by the increase coming afterwards. We're now ahead of where we were back in 2021. Okay, so this is not an easy thing to solve. Even closing down lots of travel in the pandemic didn't have much effect. So is this significant in geological terms? Well, this graph here I've put on the right is trying to show you that yes, this is significant. This is all volcanoes in grey around the Earth, and you can see that's flatlining from 1750 through to the present day, whereas the anthropogenic person-made emissions are increasing and increasing and increasing since the Industrial Revolution took place, and the fossil fuel emissions are now about 60 times more emissions than natural volcanoes. So again, it's a really big perturbation which humans have induced in the climate system. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we can start off by saying that we observe the increase and increase and increase of carbon dioxide emissions up that vertical y-axis, and projecting forwards into the future. The climate modelers and climate scientists and integrated assessment models all tell us the same thing, that we need to decrease emissions along this required line, and we need to decrease emissions and actually go back into go below the line to actually recover some of the carbon dioxide which we've already emitted. And so you can think of that as 4 steps. Firstly, to switch energy sources from coal, from gas, from oil into low carbon, minimal carbon energy sources. So that's underway, but of course, even in the UK, in Europe, we have a very biased view because we're a very industrialized but very rich society, so we're building renewables. Most other parts of the world haven't even barely started on that. So fossil fuel switching has started, but 80% or more of the world still works on fossil fuels. We can become much more efficient in the energy we use. That's clearly possible. We've, of course, known that as a species for something like 30 or 50 years. But both individually and as societies, we don't invest enough in that. So I could probably run my life using about a third or a quarter of the fossil fuel that it uses. If I wanted to do things like take more time to get the bus, car sharing, eat different food, turn the heating down, all those different types of things, as well as insulating my home, as well as draft proofing, we don't do enough of that. But those are easy actions which could be advocated and enacted profitably in most countries. And then we get into the more technological actions. So capturing and storing carbon dioxide, we can still use fossil fuels to have the benefits of the transportability, the benefits of the energy intensity of those fossil fuels, the benefits of the abundance of those fossil fuels, but only if we balance that use of fossil fuel with a capture of carbon dioxide to capture and reduce and even stop the emissions of that carbon dioxide. And Miles Allen will talk in the next presentation about why that balance is really important. And then the last thing is we need to recapture carbon dioxide and put that back underground. So we end up with a balance. So this black line is showing us a balance here, a net zero in around 2060, where the residual emissions, which are still emitting, are balanced by the recovery of capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's a net zero point. But we also need to go persistently, I think, past that single point into a persistently net negative way of operating, because we've already got too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's driving climate change already. So what does carbon capture, use and storage look like? It's intervening in all of the ways we use carbon, both fossil carbon and modern living carbon, because all of that carbon going into the atmosphere, whether it's fossil or living, is not tagged with its age. So the world climate system reacts equally to fossil carbon and to modern carbon. So carbon capture, use and storage are ways of taking that fossil carbon usage, coal, gas or oil, using that, but capturing the emissions of that as we feed that fossil carbon into our usage system, whether it's a factory, whether it's a refinery, whether it's making glass or steel, whether it's making plastic. We have to capture all of the carbon from that use and put that carbon back deep underground, 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers underground. And the liquid carbon dioxide we inject will be in between the pore spaces, the tiny holes in between the sand grains of porous sandstones. Additionally, there are very large quantities of biomass, CO2, which gets put into the atmosphere. And that's everything from tree growing and tree harvesting, from regular crop cycling. All of these can emit and do emit carbon dioxide. We emit carbon dioxide from making beer, from making fizzy drinks. We emit carbon dioxide from growing cows. All of that, we're busy venting all that biological carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that's one of the easiest carbon dioxides to capture. So it's very strange that we don't capture that and put that underground as well. So that's an intervention we can advocate for. And if we want to go into even more technology, machines now exist to undertake direct air capture, to suck carbon dioxide out of the air, literally 420 parts per million carbon dioxide in the air can be captured by chemical engineering interventions, purified and injected deep underground into the same sort of way. But of course, these machines are expensive in money, and they're also really expensive in terms of energy. So there's a lot of research and development to try and do to make those machines a lot more accessible. But those look like being essential into the sustainable future. So where does the carbon dioxide sit underground? When it goes underground, where does it go? It's a cartoon slice of a rock here, sand grains in orange, carbon dioxide in white, liquid carbon dioxide injected through a borehole, going down into this porous reservoir, carbon dioxide liquid spreading out and displacing and pushing aside the blue salty water, which is the ambient fluid in the rock, and then sealed on the top by an impermeable shale, a mud rock seal, which is impermeable to water flow, impermeable to carbon dioxide flow. So the carbon dioxide does not immediately buoyantly come back towards the surface. So this porous reservoir overlain by an impermeable seal is exactly the same combination of circumstances we're really good at finding for oil and gas deposits. So anywhere there's an oil and gas deposit, there could in principle be a carbon dioxide deposit lasting for tens of thousands, lasting for millions of years into the future. And the carbon dioxide is first of all trapped by the physical trapping underneath that shale rock seal. It's also trapped by moving through the rock and leaving little bubbles of carbon dioxide behind. It's also trapped by dissolving carbon dioxide to make fizzy, salty water, which stays underground as dense, fizzy, salty water. And eventually, over long, long periods of time, in unreactive rocks like quartz-rich sandstones, the carbon dioxide can react with minerals and form new minerals. But and we also know that if carbon dioxide is injected into basalt rocks, for example, we can make that reaction happen in weeks rather than centuries. So these are plausible ways of storing carbon dioxide. Where do we want to do that? We want to find large bodies of sandstone rock, which are maybe 100 meters in thickness, which are kilometers in width, and we can inject carbon dioxide and spread the carbon dioxide, filling the pore space in those very, very large reservoirs. Here's a reservoir in the United States, which has been eroded and exhumed at the surface. Clearly, this is not a reservoir for CO2 at the moment. It's just giving you some indication of size scale. And another indication of size scale is the site to physically superimpose these reservoirs on something we know about. So here's one example of here is the United Kingdom, Edinburgh, where I'm sitting here. The offshore oil fields are shown by circles in between Scotland and Norway. The circle is the size of diameter relating to the tonnage, millions of tons of carbon dioxide which could be injected. So there's lots and lots of storage for CO2 potentially around the UK and in many other sedimentary basins worldwide. But just to zoom in on one of those, here on the edge of the Viking Graben in the northern part of the North Sea is one oil field called the Miller oil field. Here it is magnified, that's the edge of Scotland. Miller oil field is there, just one of many hundreds of oil fields, literally. There's the Miller oil field magnified, and there's a scale bar, but that doesn't mean very much. But in the Miller oil field was a possibility for CO2 injection, was simulated, was calculated to be able to take tens of millions of tons of carbon dioxide. And if we look at a map of the city of Edinburgh on the right there, then the Miller oil field is the same size as the city of Edinburgh, where I'm sitting just now. So these are very large structures, these are very large storage sites, and this is why it's sensible to go and look for these in places which are in the offshore, places which are less populated, where we can have good quality geological data to survey the field, good quality geological data to monitor the field, because we want to determine how to inject and also to understand what's happened after we've injected. In the UK, this is now rapidly becoming a new huge industrial activity. So as I showed you in the previous slide, around the UK has been surveyed to understand where the sites for geological storage are. A geographic information system database has been created with that. And the UK government this year in 2022 created a licensing pattern, a licensing round where commercial companies could bid in for places to store carbon dioxide. So these coloured segments of the offshore area are areas which could be licensed by the government for CO2 storage. So that was open for commercial bidding, and 19 licenses have now are being awarded to something like 30 different companies. So that's the first in the world this commercial licensing has been undertaken. So this is the UK going from nothing in 2022 to possible and expected CO2 injection in several of these sites in 2027. This is now accelerating and becoming a real thing, a real commercial thing very rapidly, and will eventually become a fluid control system, the same amount of fluids every year that the oil industry around the UK pumps at the moment. Not the same value in money, but the same volume. So it's easily technologically possible. And just to be straightforward about this, the UK has about half of the CO2 storage in the North Sea. Norway has about the other half. And Norway, the country, are also developing commercial scale CO2 storage available to other countries to emplace and store their CO2 for geologically long durations, for timescales of millions of tens of millions of years. Can we tell what happens underground? Yes, we can, by using the same type of technology which oil and gas industries use to monitor and detect oil and gas fluids underground. The fluid has a different sound velocity through it compared with the surrounding rock. Here's a field in the Sleipner field, midway between Scotland and Norway, where the Norwegian company Equinor has been injecting CO2 since 1996 without any adverse effects whatsoever. And we can image that CO2, first of all, injecting into the sand. This is a seismic reflection layers. It's a cut of seismic, a horizontal map view, looking about a kilometre below the ground. Initial carbon dioxide injected in 2002, more in 2004, an extra 1 million tonnes a year, 2006, and carrying on right through, still operating to the present day. And the accuracy of this CO2 detection is extremely good. Here's a sideways view of the top sandstone layer there, and you can just see off to the side there a little appendage. That's about 150 tonnes of CO2. So in spite of having injected 20 million tonnes, you can still image tiny quantities of CO2. So the leak detection, if it did leak, the detection of leaks are extremely capable with existing technology. So to put that another way, it's like having a forest, and I could tell you if there are plus or minus 15 trees in that forest. So this is a really good and accurate, secure detection system using geology to store that carbon dioxide. What happens if it leaks? Everybody always asks me that type of question, and the answer is very little. Clearly, it's not desirable to have anything leak, but we can go to natural circumstances, such as this location in southern Italy, where there's a natural carbon dioxide seep of volcanic carbon dioxide, which has been running as a spring, as a dry spring of carbon dioxide for 2,000 years. The effects of that are local vegetation death, but as soon as the dense carbon dioxide rolls down the slope into the gully, it mixes with air, and within 100 meters, that CO2 has become dissolved and mixed in with air and is no longer hazardous to people. Where CO2 leaks into the ocean, if we develop CO2 storage sites underneath the sea, if the carbon dioxide leaks upwards to the seabed, which would obviously be not the design, but here we can see in the Tyrrhenian Sea, north of Sicily, natural carbon dioxide seeps, and there is minimal adverse effect. There are areas where the bubbles come out, bubbles of carbon dioxide come out on the seabed, maybe 50, 100 meters in diameter, but we're still having wildlife swimming through, fish swim through, the sea urchins and the benthic life have maybe moved out of the way, but again, it's not an environmental huge catastrophe. It's undesirable, but we can manage that. And if the infrastructure transport engineered by humans has an accident, here's a pipe.
I'm not sure what's just happened, whether this is at Stuart's end or this end. Can anybody put the hand up if they
I think it's Stuart's end, Mads, because I've got the same problem.
Right. Well, hopefully he will be back on. It was so very interesting. Okay. All right. Stuart is already back.
Right, I'm back. Can you see my screen, Mads?
Not at the moment. I can just see you.
Okay, well, that's terrific. You can see me. Let's try and get out of this then. So I'll need to screen share again, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay, getting that. Okay, that should be visible now.
Yep.
Now, I mentioned at the beginning that this is carbon storages, both for big industrial operations like I've just talked about, but also can be more local and more accessible. So here are two pictures which tries to show that, but also to make contrast between that. On the right, we've got geological storage, being the White Cliffs of Dover in southern England, which are entirely composed of Upper Cretaceous chalk. So those are 100% carbonate rock. That's a natural geological store of the carbon going into carbonate mineral and being safe and securely stored for tens of millions of years. On the left, a different landscape. This happens to be northern Normandy in France, but we've got carbon storage in the hedgerows, we've got carbon storage in the forests, we've got carbon storage in the less intensive agricultural use of this landscape. So a lot of carbon can be stored there. In both these places, carbon can be stored, but clearly the storage in the chalk is in many ways very reliable. It's had no intervention for 60 million years and it's still there. So geological storage can be very, very long-term, very reliable, very safe and secure. On the left, the landscape storage, the vegetation storage is very low cost in the sense that those trees are capturing carbon dioxide every day at minimal cost. The hedgerows are capturing carbon dioxide at minimal cost, but we could fell all those trees next week. So it's unreliable. It's cheap to capture, but unreliable in duration. And if we have large forests, if we have forests and use forests or peat or soil as carbon stores, we have to figure out and have to work out how we're going to manage that difference in duration, how we're going to value that. So in Scotland, where I live, there's a lot of conversation about using peat, natural organic soil, which covers very large areas of Scotland. Maybe 40% of the land area is covered with peat. But it turns out that looking at the peat, surveying the peat, for some of the first satellite surveys, shows that a lot of the peat areas are degrading. They're actually in. So here's on the right, the small red splodges, the small red spots are perhaps less visible, but quite large areas of peat are in poor condition because it's been drained. People have tried to drain these areas for better agriculture, to grow game birds and hunting and shooting. And actually that's degraded the peat. So a lot of peatland is degraded and it's emitting carbon dioxide. So even if we repair those drains, block up those drains, re-wet the landscape, we're not going to store anything. We're just going to stop the emission. So we need to make sure that we're doing our assessments correctly. Trees are also very popular, and we can plant a lot of trees, but we also need to be aware of the uncertainties and the risks. Trees are a very low-cost capture method, but if I hunt for the 1,000-year-old forest in Britain, then there are hardly any 1,000-year-old forests. So keeping trees existing in forests for a long time is unreliable. And each of us, if we went for trees, each of us in the industrial world would need at least 3 football pitches to be dedicated to our trees throughout our entire lifetime. Young trees, medium-aged trees and old trees growing to capture the carbon which we're emitting. And that's difficult to do because tree maintenance is vulnerable to fire, to pests, to humans changing their minds. And we've seen lots of evidence now of fire in the landscape, fire in forests which have been managed for different purposes are vulnerable to being carbon stores which go up in smoke. And I want to have the last couple of slides to think about how long do we want to store this for. So here's a graph, modeled graph by Anders Lingfeldt in Gothenburg University, where he's modeled the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide. What would happen if we put a spike of 800 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere within 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years, which is what we're doing now. Okay, during this period, we're heading towards the billion tons of CO2. If we put it into a store, which then leaks immediately within the first, has 100% release within 100 years, then all of that CO2 goes into the atmosphere and it increases the CO2 in the atmosphere because the store's leaky. The store hasn't done anything really worth having. And that CO2 stays in the atmosphere. And if you follow that black line, CO2 stays in the atmosphere and stays in the atmosphere and stays in the atmosphere and doesn't get down to anything like where we were for 10,000, 20,000 years into the future. By contrast, if we want to put 800 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, but we capture it using carbon capture and storage, and we store it underground in geological stores, then that does not go into the atmosphere. But if those stores gradually leak over a 10,000 year period, then that carbon dioxide gradually leaks out, but has a much, much, much less effect or a minimal effect on the atmosphere. So what I'm trying to point out here is when we choose storage sites, we've got to assess and be rigorous and communicate that short duration stores, which may be very popular, are great, but they're not going to be enough. So nature is good, but unreliable perhaps, or not as long lasting. Whereas geology can be slightly harder to understand, but is very reliable. It's good value for the long term. And so how to express that in a simple way is, let's think about the value for a lifetime of these different types of storage, of geological storage, of weathering of rocks, of charcoal in the ground, trees, or growing tomatoes. So tomatoes might have a lifetime of 1 year of storage if we stored it in the fridge for a long time. I want to go back, sorry, a lifetime of 1 year. So we're not going to value that very much for the long term. That maybe we have to say is a low value, so we need to buy a lot of tomatoes to have any effect, and that would be a temporary basis. Whereas at the other extreme, geological storage, we can assert with great confidence that that is stored for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. So if we buy 1 credit from that, we're able to pay more, but we only need to buy 1 credit. So overall, in the full swing of geological history going forwards, then geological storage is better value, it's cheaper, it's more reliable. So we need to find some way of making sure we can communicate this so that people and companies and businesses and governments who are interested in short duration storage price this and value this correctly, in contrast or as in combination with long duration geological storage. So to finish off where we are, the UK is busy heading for its decarbonisation of its industrial centres, on the right-hand graph showing you the map of where our big industries are, with carbon capture and storage at industrial scale. And each of those clusters looks something like this one in Scotland. It's capturing and storing carbon dioxide from industrial facilities like oil refineries, like compressor terminals, like oil and gas operations. It's also trying to capture biogas from farm CO2. It's also trying to convert methane into CO2 and hydrogen for the future as a low carbon fuel, but capture and store that CO2. It's trying to store CO2, which can be imported across the ocean, and do some air capture. So this is what the UK is heading for. The CO2 should be starting to go into the ground in 2027. And this hopefully is the start of a gradual rollback, which has to become a rapid rollback of our CO2 emissions heading into the sustainable future. And if people are interested to follow this up, then University of Edinburgh offers a MOOC, a massive online free course, and you can register on that web link. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. That was great. You brought us nicely back on time. And I've heard good things about the MOOC. So although I've not had the chance to do it myself, it should be recommended. Thank you, Stuart.
Okay, pleasure.
Next up is Miles Allen to make the case for geological net zero. And this is good because he's not a geologist, so or maybe he's becoming one. Over to you, Miles.
No, just a fan of geology, which I hope gets me into this community at least. Okay, well, I'll share my screen, and just to sort of, for those who don't know me, I am a physicist by background, but I worked on the case for net zero back in the 2000s, and I want to talk to you about geological net zero. Not because the world needs a new phrase, but because I think the world needs the geological community to, if you like, take back net zero, take ownership of this concept, which should have been yours all along. And as sort of and as Stuart was alluding to, you've rather lost control of it. So let me just remind you, let's go back 15 years to what climate policy was all about before net zero. And the model people had in their heads in the 2000s was this idea of contraction and convergence, that rich countries with high per capita emissions would shrink their emissions, poor countries like India would increase their per capita emissions, and everybody would meet in the middle, and we'd all live happily ever after. The difficulty with this was that it didn't actually work with the way the climate system worked, because it turned out there was no long-term sustainable rate of emission of carbon dioxide. that we could all aim for. The only acceptable one, the only ongoing rate of emission of carbon dioxide that was consistent with no further warming was 0. So this is a slide produced by Aubrey Mayer back in the early 1990s, showing this contraction and convergence idea. And that's what emissions have done since then, rather depressingly. That's what they thought was needed to stop climate change, the blue arrow there. And the red arrow shows what's actually needed. And the reason this matters is because the difference between the blue and red arrow is, I'll try and convince you, all about geology. This is why this matters for you. You could argue that if Aubrey Mayer had been right, if the solution to climate change was to reduce emissions by maybe 50% on their 1990 level, we'd be able to do that by laying off geologists rather than re-employing them, that you guys wouldn't really have much of a role in that transition. But one might say, fortunately for you, it turns out he was wrong, and that we actually need to get emissions down to net zero to stop climate change. By the way, when we started, it was interesting looking back at sort of how net zero started life. And it was actually pretty simple. It's got very, very complicated since then. But here's a snapshot from a slide. I actually found this laptop with this old presentation on it dating from 2005 in a drawer, and somewhat to my amazement, it was possible to switch it on again. And you can see back then, we were talking about limiting fossil emissions. That was essentially the only point of zero. We didn't talk about net zero either. We just talked about limiting total carbon dioxide emissions with an overwhelm, and our emphasis was entirely on the fossil component of that. To put it simply, we need to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming, and because we need to do it soon, by mid-century, if we're actually going to meet the Paris goals, we need to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming before the world stops using fossil fuels. And I'm showing you this image because if anybody tells you that there's plenty of time to move the world on from using fossil fuels, or that with a high enough carbon price, we'll all just stop using fossil fuels spontaneously. This is a picture of a village in Greece where they discovered the village was built on lignite, and they literally dug out the ground underneath their houses, leaving only the church standing in order to get at those fossil fuels. So if anybody tells you, any economist colleagues of yours tells you a carbon price will solve this problem, the carbon price would have to be higher than the threat of eternal damnation to actually stop us using fossil fuels. How then do we stop fossil fuels from causing global warming, given that we're still using them, and in fact are using them at a faster rate than ever? Well, one popular, very popular in the past couple of years approach has been the idea that nature will come to our aid, and that we will get rid of the carbon dioxide generated by using fossil fuels by planting trees, restoring forests, restoring ecosystems, blue carbon, coastal ecosystems, and so on. It's all very fashionable. The World Economic Forum was launched a Trillion Trees campaign. I mean, Stuart's already talked about this, so excuse me, so I don't need to dwell on it. But the fundamental problem, of course, is, as Stuart emphasized, nature is fragile. Carbon stored at the Earth's surface is vulnerable to changing policies, changing governments, changing weather. One thing Stuart didn't mention is that as the world warms, we expect a lot of our current biospheric sinks to become sources. For example, one sink that Stuart mentioned, peatlands, if Britain were to dry out badly through climate change, a lot of our peatlands would become sources even without us doing anything else, just because of the action of climate change itself. Now, I'm not suggesting that's necessarily going to happen, but it's a risk. Carbon stored at the Earth's surface is vulnerable to our changing climate, which is why using it to claim that we are compensating for the use of our ongoing use of fossil fuels is risky at best, and one might argue disingenuous at worst. The limits, we explored the limits to nature-based solutions in a paper led by Cécile Girardin last year, which showed that even if you take the most optimistic estimates available of what we can store in the biosphere through nature-based solutions over the coming decades, we might shave those initiatives might shave 1/10 of a degree off global temperatures by mid-century, perhaps 2 to 3/10 of a degree by the end of the century. And that's in the context of an ongoing fossil fuel driven warming of 2/10 of a degree per decade. So nature can help, but it's not the solution. And we need therefore to go beyond that, the rather comfortable idea that we can carry on with burning fossil fuels and just plant trees to compensate. So some people have moved on from that, and indeed the whole idea of net zero has got a bit of a bad rap over the past few years, because people have sort of seen it as a bit of an excuse for business as usual while claiming we're going to plant some trees to compensate. And indeed, in a group of quite prominent scientists, including Bob Watson, formerly of the IPCC, published a paper in Conversation a year and a half ago or so, talking about how the concept of net zero itself had become a dangerous trap, and many young people now are campaigning for an end to fossil fuel use entirely, the sort of keep it in the ground movement. The difficulty with this, and something we should all remember, is it's all very well saying keep it in the ground, but you have to ask yourself, excuse me, whose ground are we talking about keeping it in? This is randomly pulled off the web, a map of prospective wells, sort of wells that geoexpro.com is particularly excited about this year. And the vast majority of them are in developing countries, vast majority in Africa, and indeed around 27 African countries are, I understand, heading for COP27 to protest about the fact that one of the key outcomes of COP26 was a decision to discontinue lending money to fossil fuel projects. So they feel that the same countries that are currently encouraging investment in extraction, well, for example, this country, which is currently encouraging investment in extraction of fossil carbon from the North Sea, is banning our development banks from lending money to Mozambique to extract much more accessible gas from off Mozambique. So, you know, there is a certain inconsistency here, and they are demanding the right for Africa to use Africa's fossil fuels, which seems very hard to argue against. Let's just step back and think about, you know, where we're at and where we're going in terms of because there was a rather depressing result in that poll. So I'd like to reassure you that this is a solvable problem. This is where we're at the moment. Very large flux of carbon dioxide coming out of the geosphere, the lithosphere or geosphere, solid earth, rocks, sediments, fossil fuels, being dumped in the atmosphere. And some of that is being taken up by enhanced sinks in the biosphere, but more is being taken out of the biosphere and dumped in the atmosphere as well. So the amount in the atmosphere is going up very rapidly. What many people think of as net zero is this situation where we're continuing to emit from fossil fuels and industrial processes. But we are balancing that emission by the big black arrow, planting trees, restoring ecosystems, moving carbon back into the biosphere. But you've only got to look at this slide to realize this is not an indefinitely sustainable solution. This can only be a temporary situation because we can't be fluxing carbon out of the geosphere into the biosphere indefinitely. And so to achieve durable net zero, we need to ramp up our efforts to return carbon to the geosphere, in particular by ramping up our efforts to capture carbon from the atmosphere and capture carbon where it's produced in industrial processes, and perhaps recapture carbon dioxide from the biosphere, and achieve what we call geological net zero. That's where all the carbon dioxide that's being generated by any continued use of fossil carbon sources, that's coal, oil, natural gas, and limestone for cement, is balanced by a restoring of permanent restorage of carbon dioxide back into the Earth's crust. So this is how you stop fossil fuels from causing global warming. In so-called technology neutral, that's scenarios that don't exclude explicitly any particular technology, they just sort of allow the model, an economic model here of the global economy, to find the cheapest path to achieving net zero and limiting the increase in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And this is what happens in the average of those scenarios considered by the IPCC. First of all, of course, we burn a lot less. We do replace a lot of fossil fuels with renewable energy and simply using them more efficiently as well. But that contributes about 2/3 to 3/4 of the overall reduction in emissions to the atmosphere. So the blue line here is emissions to the atmosphere. The black line is the total amount of carbon dioxide still produced from energy and industrial processes. So the rest has to be stored back underground with the technologies that Stuart was describing through carbon capture and storage, either at source or direct air capture from the atmosphere. So we currently store back into the Earth's crust around 0.1% of the carbon dioxide generated by ongoing fossil fuel use. So we store 40 million tons of carbon dioxide per year, and we're generating almost 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. So of every ton of carbon dioxide we produce, which, by the way, in the form it's stored, it would be a liquid with a density similar to water. So think of it as a cubic meter of a ton of carbon dioxide, a cubic meter of liquid, 1 liter of which we currently store responsibly back into the Earth's surface, and the other 999 liters of which we just tip into the atmosphere. So that's what we're doing at the moment. Geological net zero is reducing the amount of carbon dioxide we produce, raising the amount of carbon dioxide we store until they balance. The challenge, of course, is that we are, if you look at the economics of this, storing carbon dioxide is expensive. This is a figure, it's from Goldman Sachs, but it represents the sort of consensus on this and also represents what we can see people investing in at the moment, which is that it's generally, it shows the cost of reducing emissions either by reducing the amount of carbon dioxide we produce in red or increasing the amount of carbon dioxide we store in blue. And for most of the way to net zero, it's cheaper to avoid producing carbon dioxide than it is to increase storage of carbon dioxide. But the two curves have a very different shape. The red curve stays cheap for quite a long time and then becomes very, very, very expensive as you run up against activities like aviation, for which there is no obvious alternative to using fossil fuels at the moment. As the blue curve starts off more expensive, but eventually stabilizes at the cost of capturing carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere and re-injecting it back underground. It can't get more expensive than that. And that's estimated around $250 per ton of CO2 at the moment. So this is the implication of this, and it fits that the scenario that I showed you in the previous slide, that we can get sort of 2/3 to 3/4 of the way there by just reducing the amount of carbon dioxide we produce. But the last quarter, it makes the most sense to deal with that quarter by just sticking it back underground, by storing it away. And of course, the reason that these are the technologies we're talking about, and almost all of them, with the exception of the sort of 3 green squares over on the left, involve geological carbon dioxide storage. So it involves your community doing an awful lot of work over the next 30 years to get that 0.1% we're storing at the moment up to 100% by 2050. The reason this number, that sort of 25%-ish, is important is if you remember back at the beginning, I was talking about climate policy before net zero. There was a time when we thought 80% or 75% reductions were what we needed to do. And so if that was the case, then we wouldn't need geological storage to stop climate change. But it's not. We have to get 100% reductions. We have to get to net zero, which is why geological storage is absolutely essential to delivering our climate goals. So this is the case for geological net zero. Unfortunately, and I say this with some pain as somebody who's sort of devoted much of the past 15 years of my life to net zero, it's become a very vague and almost unhelpful term. It's just become synonymous with high climate ambition. The ISO guidelines for net zero, which have just been released, run to 45 pages. It's often associated in many people's minds with offsetting fossil fuel emissions with biological storage. And for many young people, it's seen as a bit of a cop-out, and rightly so for many of the ways it's used. I think to sort of recover our reputation, so to speak, as a climate community, we need to come out and make it clear that the only long-term solution to any ongoing production of fossil carbon dioxide is geological storage. So geological net zero is an ongoing balance between carbon dioxide produced from fossil sources and carbon dioxide geologically stored. And crucially, it's simple, it's very easy to measure, and it's clear. It's less open to being gamed in the way that it seems net zero has been. We need a recognition of the need for geological net zero from governments and companies. It's interesting that no government, no company has yet come out in all of these great ambitious meetings to say we need geological net zero. That the phrase isn't even out there. So geological societies could really take a huge lead here and make a massive difference to clarifying the climate challenge by pointing out to the world the need for geological net zero. And I hope we'll come back to this in the discussion because it's such an important point for the world to take on board. Thank you.
Thank you, Miles. That was clear and powerful as usual. Just what we hoped for. I look forward to the discussion as well. I'm sure there'll be some interesting questions. Now, next up is, we're very pleased to have with us today Professor Qingcheng He from who's the head of CCS for the China Geological Survey, and he will tell us what China is currently doing in this very important area. So over to you, Professor He.
Yes, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. And this is Qingcheng speaking, okay, in Beijing, China. So I'm honored to be here to share with you some cases in China, so geoscience solutions for net zero. So maybe already you know the Chinese government has promised on net zero. China aims to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality. It means net zero before 2060. So this is pronounced by the Chinese president in 2020. So now the policy on net zero has become the Chinese government's very basic policy. So for the carbon emissions peak and the net zero, so what is the peak volume? maybe you all already know that at the moment China is the largest the country for its carbon emission. So at the moment maybe it's 10 billion tons CO2 per year. So what is the peak volume? So based some data show that in 2030 the peak will be 11 or 13 billion tons per year. So for the 2060, so will be the net zero. That's 30 years only in between. It's a very big change for Chinese government. So for the current carbon emissions in China, so for example, in 2020, China's CO2 emissions was about 10 billion tons, mainly from the fossil fuel combustion. So, and the fossil energy accounts for nearly 84 or 85% of China's total energy consumption. So this picture shows us the source of the CO2 emissions in China. So you can see most the source from the coal, So you know, this is China is the largest country for the production of the coal, and the second is oil. But the cement production is also one of the main sources of CO2 the emissions. So that is the Chinese the source of structure. So if we look at this picture, we'll see the carbon emission versus the energy consumption scenarios. So we set two scenarios. This is so now Chinese government will set a goal to change its the energy structure. It means to try to use more clean energy, not to deeply rely on coal energy. So the scientists so predicted that when the clean energy accounts for 70%, there's still so about 6 billion tons of CO2 to be emitted. So if the clean energy accounts for the 85%, so you know at the moment, so the fossil energy account for the 84 or 85%. So if we change reverse, if clean energy accounts for the 85%, so still has about 2 billion tons CO2 to be emitted. It means, so even in the 2060, that is the Chinese policy for net zero the year, so we still have the 2 billion tons CO2 to be emitted. And this is a big challenge. How to remove these 2 billion tons CO2? That's the big challenge. So at the moment, we calculated the ecological carbon sink with like the tree, grass, wetland, something. So at the moment, the contribution of China's ecological carbon sinks only contributed 10 or 20% of the anthropogenic emissions. So at the moment, the main data show that so only 737 million tons. So the remove and the CO2 can be removed by the ecological carbon sink. So you can imagine. So the big challenge for the government. So to change the energy structure and try to find a new carbon sink. That's very challenging. So at this time, at this case, so the geological carbon sink is a most thing we have to think. So now China Geological Survey, so the focus on so 2 of them. So of course we have some other geological carbon sink like the Sitkan rock. But here I just share with you the 2 kind of the geological carbon sink. One is the cast carbon sink. So that is carbonate the dissolution process. The second one is the CO2 geological storage. And for the cast carbon sink, So maybe you know already. So in China, raise area, total area of the 3.44 million kilometer square karst area. Most distributed in the south or southwest of China, for China. So and my colleague has calculated the carbon sink flux is about 180 million tons of CO2 per year. So this number is about the half of the terrestrial vegetation, and 68% of the forest. And so it's the one of the big carbon sink. Yeah, you cannot neglect it. You cannot neglect it. So I think this formula for most of you are very familiar. There's limestone dissolution and dolomite dissolution. But unfortunately, so this formulation, the change direction can be changed. Depends on the temperature and then the pressure and so on. So and my colleague and had some projects. So in more detail about how to make this change in one direction. It means it increases more carbon sink direction. So we have some countermeasures for that. And now we are introducing some countermeasures to the southwest of China to try to make more karst carbon sink. That is the karst carbon sink. Another we are researching now. The second one is the CO2 geological storage. At the moment, the common storage in the body is the deep saline aquifer and oil and gas field and deep core seam. And about these three bodies, so we have done some work and some deep research on that. So the first we had made geological storage potential only in the land area in China, not including the sea area. So for different kind of the storage body, we calculated the potential of the storage of CO2. And for the conservative estimate and then optimistic estimate. So for these two potential, we can see, okay, in China, in the land area only has a large potential for storing CO2 for CO2. So for the deep saline aquifer is the widely distributed in China, and especially distributed in the northwest part of China. Most of this are the base for energy, and the more power plant there are, more the refinery plant there are. So and you know already IPCC so the predicts that so in 2050 so there are about 5.6 billion tons CO2 should be removed by the CCS. Now at the moment only 40 million tons per year. But according Chinese experts predict that in 2060, so about 1 to 2 billion tons of CO2 per year will be removed by CCS. So at the moment only less than 2 million tons per year. It means, okay, so we have a lot of work to do for the storing CO2 in the geological body. And at the moment that we set, so we by the survey we find so there are 5 largest potential storage areas in China. So they are Songliao Basin, Bohai Bay Basin, and Ordos Basin, Talimu Basin, Jing'er Basin, And fortunately, the thing is that all of this basin are the industry clusters, and also they are base of the energy. And of course, a lot of the saline aquifer is distributed there. So the more than 90% of the large-scale emission sources are less than 200 kilometers away from this potential storage sites, storage sites. So now the total of the 40 CCUS projects, 22 in operation in last year, and with a storage of the 1.7 million tons CO2, the cumulative storage of more than 10 million tons. So that's the distribution map of CCUS projects in China. And sorry, it was in Chinese. And we can see that most of the CCUS projects is operated by the oil company. For the pure fuel storage project, it's not so much. So because of the profit and because of the budget, I think in the coming few years, Chinese government set a budget for the pure storage of the CO2. So, and we had some demonstration projects. So this is one of them. So this project is executed by my team. So about 10 years ago. So that is a Shenhua saline aquifer case. So in this case, we set capture and storage. So it's of course this is the first core-based CCS demonstration project, and also first saline water carbon sequestration project. And so because of the first one, so we carefully made a site assessment. So in the beginning, so we set the 21 simultaneous injections. So for the 3 years, we injected a total of the 300,000 tons of CO2, and at the moment, so 10 years we monitoring runs quite well. So this is the case of this project. This case of project, we set the injection well. We also set the monitoring well, and we have the simulation. We have the model. So now this project is a demonstration for the other project now. So that is the injection process curve. We had this the history matching. So far so good. Okay, so we are confident. So to use the saline water aquifer for storing CO2. And so by this case, we can say geologists can do more for net zero. So for example, so we can use our geoscience knowledge. We can reduce carbon. So we can find some new energy sources like the hot dry rock. So now in China, we had two sites, two demonstration projects for using hot dry rock to make energy. Of course, and there we We also in the sea area find some natural gas and the gas hydrate. And also we set some several demonstrators for the compressed ion energy storage. So that is to reduce the carbon. Also, we can increase the carbon sink, like I talked. So we in the cluster area, we try to change something to increase to artificially increase the sink of the cluster area. And also we had a survey, we had some accurate site assessment for the more CO2 storage. So I think so the geoscience can play a very important role, okay, in the way of the net zero. So the now I just share with you some case study and some work we have done. Okay, so that's my short presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, King Cheng. This is
you.
a really excellent overview of what's happening in China on this front. It's clearly hugely important to all of us that this goes well. So a lot on your shoulders. I'm sure there'll be some questions for you in the Q&A later on. So
okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay, our final speaker for this afternoon, before we start the full-blown questions, is Sana Al-Sayyoud from the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department in Al Bayt University. Apologies for the pronunciation. She in Jordan, and she will tell us about geothermal solutions to heating, cooling and heating, and also their potential to progress net zero. Over to you, Sana.
Yeah, hello. Could you hear me? Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. I will start thanking you all for this really brilliant event. And I will take you around on the geothermal solutions for cooling and heating, especially in Jordan, and then have some global potential ideas to contribute to net zero. So I could say that Jordan geothermal resources is really considered as one of the promising new green energy, renewable energy in Jordan. And really Jordan is blessed with very potential resources. Shallow geothermal systems currently are likely to be promising for future utilization in the country. The deep heat sources are very promising also, but it is not yet utilized in Jordan. We have different applications. We currently use it for direct and indirect geothermal utilization, but still we are in a very preliminary stages in geothermal investigations and also tracing the impact on local and national socio-economic scale. So affordable, integrated and sustainable strategy for geothermal resources development in Jordan is becoming very essential in the future. I could say here that Jordan has different potential areas, especially around our Dead Sea area, whereas this area is really very high, has a very high heat flow, and the gradient here is beyond 5 degrees. But also we had a lot of other geological areas in Jordan has geothermal potential. Here, for example, another one on a triple border area, it's a Risha called the Risha, and we have another 2 areas scattered in middle and also in the eastern part of Jordan.
So it has been found in some areas, the water temperature increasing and also maybe exceeding 78 degrees. So the geothermal potential in Jordan is expected really to have or to be a large potential in the MENA area. What we are utilizing the thermal water in Jordan, currently we have just some indirect and direct utilization. Thermal water mainly in Western Jordan is utilized for just curative water for its therapeutic value. The high mineralization as well as also high temperature is recommended for several types of treatments, and that's what we are doing in Jordan, just using the geothermal resources for a very modest, let's say, utilization. What I'm looking to spread out or elaborate about geothermal energy in Jordan is how the really geothermal locations and geothermal gradients and also which scattered around the local residents could be utilized in Jordan. Maybe for power generation, and this is something to be considered in the near future, especially in the area where the Dead Sea I showed you just before, where we have really a high gradient. And also we could use it for as a ground source heat pumps for heating and cooling. I will show you in the next slides. Greenhouse heating, we have some potential, especially where the temperature, especially in winter, really go very deep in cooling or in cool areas, especially in the desert. I mean, the desert nights are already cold, but in winter, the frost maybe happen when we've got -10, for example, at nights. Aquaculture also could be a potential for Jordan, crops drying, spa and resorts, and mineral extraction. What I'm thinking also and also emphasize on in Jordan, that we have to integrate the science and the social aspects in local communities development. And this is one of my ideas, to have a social science integration projects on national and also on local scale in Jordan. So the research lines in Jordan could be very wide. We could evaluate the current geothermal resources and exploring also the potentials. We also have to investigate the thermophysical properties, and this is something happened and done in very small areas and restricted in some parts in Jordan. We have also to assess the hydrogeological characteristics of the reservoir. Geothermometers also has to be done. Also, we're looking to have some models and some calibrations for other ground temperature, and to assess the direct and indirect utilization. What we've also think about utilization for cooling and even heating in Jordan, because we need cooling and heating as well in all over the Jordanian area, is to use the open and the closed loop in Jordan. And currently, actually, we have some buildings. We have one university, for example, which is Madaba, in Madaba, it's the American Jordanian University. It's totally heated and cooled by geothermal closed loop system. So this is something we're thinking about, especially in the shadow of the climate change and temperature differences between summer and winter as well. I have here some suggestions regarding the dynamic cooling model. And I already discussed that with some of my colleagues here in Jordan and in Germany as well, that we could use the dynamic cooling model, especially in the desert at daytime, where we could use the annual alternating operation, and the heat plume as well will be carried away using the groundwater. and the operational gradient will working against the natural gradients. That's why we could have this alternating operation in the second year, where the gradient also is working with the parallel to the natural gradient. So this is one of the suggested models. And the other suggestion could be also use the night sky cooling for industrial applications and also for domestic, where we could operate the system. This is what you can see here is without night sky cooling. The system, the open system, what I mentioned before. And at night, we could use the night sky cooling for heat exchange between the system, and also, especially that we have really cold nights here in the desertic area. So another also research line, which is currently happening in Jordan, and we are, as a researchers and earth scientists, try to elaborate the renewable energy and have an integrated renewable energy systems for the green cities. Currently, as a developing country, I could say that we don't have really such a complete or a comprehensive system for having such green cities as what we do have in the developed countries. So what we're looking for is to have completely renewable energy operation systems in the cities, where we could use the geothermal and solar and also the wind energy. So Jordan, as a part of geothermal story, ending up to net zero, is a part of what we have in the globe or in our world. I could consider that many countries really, especially in MENA region, show really high potential for geothermal energy and need to be evaluated for future utilization. So the updated investigation should be also delivered to the public and private sectors, and should be highlighted for the decision makers that the geothermal potential really in our areas has a huge, and we could also highlight the applications, even if these applications are on science or on social aspects. So the integrated plan for such utilization and application is really very essential, especially in the policies and strategies and on the national scale, and also maybe in MENA region scale. Also, I could say that geothermal utilization could really be very positive environmental aspect, and also could contribute very efficient in the national economic situation for the country. Despite of the political and technical and financial barriers which may be faced even in the developing countries, the exploitation of new geothermal utilization on this scale and also globally will really contribute the solution for the socio-economic and environmental problems challenging our area. My prospects regarding the academia as a part of geothermal story leading to net zero results, academia really shows high potential to do all aspects regarding creating, elaborating, and also engaging communities in future collaboration. So I could say that the academia could have really a good step to keep a brilliant fingerprint on having the right role in mitigate and adapt climate change. Also the awareness through the participation of students, and this is what we're working here as an academic institution for earth and environmental sciences, involving them in the activities on local communities and also in some national and international activities regarding exploitation the natural resources is very important. Also encouraging them to participate in all green activities regarding climate change advocacy and also adaptation and mitigation. This is also I could consider is very important. As a developing, we are facing problems regarding the funds for really much more green activities, especially in research and also in the academia and the students' interaction with the climate change. So the injecting much more funds for researchers, students, and academic institutions for future research is really very important to adaptation and mitigation the climate change, and to have the really net zero, and to be one of these community which are looking for completely green life situation. So thank you very much. That was my talk, and I'm happy to have to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Sana, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the technical session, if you like. And it was a great overview of what's happening in Jordan in terms of the